I pulled the trims from doubled phrasing and a few redundant sensory beats. A boot slipped on the wet steel of a rusted cage. A woman grabbed the bars as the floor dropped out beneath her. The cage plunged into the dark, cables screaming, and cold air rushed up to meet her. Her stomach lurched. She couldn't see the bottom. She couldn't see the top. Just black rock sliding past on every side. Beside her, a big shepherd dog pressed against her legs, ears flat, a low growl building in his chest. The cage slammed to a stop 900 feet under the Kansas prairie. Her hands were shaking. She was a nurse named Delia Marsh, and she had come down here to sign papers and sell a mine she'd never wanted. She did not know that dog was about to lead her to something sealed away for 40 years. What Barnaby found behind those rotted boards changed everything. Stay with me here. 2 weeks earlier, Delia Marsh had never once thought about salt. She thought about rent. She thought about the light bill and the transmission on the Ford that groaned every time she backed out of the driveway. That was her life in the winter of 1974. A small house on the edge of Hutchinson, a night shift at St. Elizabeth's, and a daughter named June who was 9 years old and still slept with the lamp on. Delia was 38, 2 years a widow. Her husband Tom had dropped dead in the driveway on a Tuesday, 39 years old, a heart nobody knew was breaking until it stopped. He left her a mortgage, a daughter, and a dog. That was the estate, so she worked. She pulled doubles. She counted pills and changed dressings and held the hands of old men who had nobody else, and she came home when the sky was going gray. She was tired in a way that had gotten into her bones. Believe me, she wasn't waiting for a miracle. She'd stopped believing in those. Then the letter came. It was on good paper, the kind that means a lawyer. The name at the top was a firm in Wichita. She read it 3 times before the words made sense. A man named Silas Marsh had died. He was her great-uncle, and he had left everything he owned to her. Now here's the thing. Delia had heard that name exactly once in her whole life. Her mother, Ruth, had said it one winter night years ago, and she'd said it the way you say the name of a bruise. Silas. Ruth's face had gone hard and closed, and when Delia asked who that was, her mother said, nobody. A man who's dead to this family, and that was the end of it. Then Ruth herself passed quietly in 1969 and took whatever she knew with her. But Silas wasn't dead to this family. Not then. He'd been alive the whole time, 91 years old, living alone above a working salt mine outside town. And now he was gone, and Delia was, apparently, the last Marsh left standing. She drove to Wichita on her day off. The lawyer was an old man named Ferris with reading glasses pushed up on his bald head. He slid a folder across the desk and folded his hands. Your great-uncle owned a controlling stake in the Prairie Rock Salt Company, he said. The mine's still operating. There's the surface house, some acreage, and the workings below. It's a real asset, Mrs. Marsh. Modest, but real. Delia sat very still. How real? Enough to change your circumstances. He looked at her over the glasses, and she understood he'd seen her coat and her shoes and the tired around her eyes. You could sell it. There's a buyer sniffing around already. You'd walk away with more money than you've likely ever held. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt her mother's face. That closed, hard look. A man who's dead to this family. Why me? She asked. He never met me. I never met him. Ferris shuffled his papers. There's a condition, small one. He put it in the will himself in his own hand. He read it out. The property passes to Delia Marsh only if she goes down into the mine, to the 9th level herself in person, before she signs anything. Delia almost laughed. That's it. He wants me to take a tour. That's it, Ferris said, but he wasn't smiling. Old men get strange, Mrs. Marsh. Humor him. Go down, look around, come back up, sign the papers. Then it's yours to sell. So that was the plan. Go down, look around, sign, and finally breathe. She left June with a neighbor, and she took Barnaby because Barnaby was Tom's dog, 100 pounds of gray-faced shepherd who hadn't left her side since the driveway, and because going down a hole in the ground alone felt like something she didn't want to do without one living thing that loved her. The mine office was a low brick building on the flat land west of town, wind hammering the windows. A foreman named Gus Halloran met her there. He was 60-some, thick through the shoulders with a face like a dropped fist. He didn't like her being there. She could tell that in 10 seconds. "Ladies don't go down," he said. "Insurance." "The will says I go down." She handed him Ferris's letter. "You worked for Silas Marsh." 41 years. He read the letter and something moved behind his eyes quick, and then it was gone. "All right, the cage, watch your feet, and keep that animal on a rope." He didn't say another word until the cage doors closed. And that's how Delia Marsh, who wanted nothing but to sign a paper and go home to her daughter, ended up 900 feet down in the cold and the dark with a shaking hand and a growling dog. She just didn't know yet that Silas had sent her down there on purpose. He wanted her to find it. He'd been waiting 40 years for someone to come. Down at the bottom, the dark wasn't like night. Night has a sky. This was different. The cage opened onto a room carved out of gray-white rock, lit by strings of bare bulbs that ran off into tunnels in 3 directions. The air was dry and dead still. "Main haulage that way," Gus said, pointing his lamp. "Active faces are east. Everything west is mined out, old workings. We don't go there anymore." He said west like it was a wound. Barnaby stood pressed against her leg, and he wasn't growling now, but his whole body was rigid, his nose working, his ears swinging toward the west tunnel like a compass needle. He whined, high and thin. "He smell a rat," Gus said, "plenty down here." "He doesn't do that," Delia said. "I've had this dog 2 years, he doesn't do that." Gus wanted to show her the active mine. The conveyors, the drills, the loading pockets. That was the tour. That was what Silas meant, surely, and she should walk it and nod and go back up. But Barnaby pulled. He put his 100 pounds into the rope and pulled her toward the mined-out west, making a sound low in his chest that she had never once heard him make. "Where does the west tunnel go?" she asked. "Nowhere," Gus said, "too fast. Dead ground, it's not safe. Roof's old." But Delia was already following the dog. She couldn't have said why. Maybe because for 2 years she had done the safe thing, the tired thing, the thing that kept the lights on, and here in the dark something in her was tired of that too. She followed Barnaby into the west workings while Gus called after her, and then swore, and then came clomping behind. The tunnel narrowed. The bulbs ended and her lamp was all there was. Old rail track ran under the salt, rusted solid. Timbers, black with age, held the roof and some had split. Barnaby went at a trot now, nails clicking, pulling her deeper, past side rooms full of nothing but stacked salt and the ghosts of old work, and then he stopped. He stopped so suddenly she nearly fell over him. He was standing in front of a wall, not rock. Wood. A whole section of the tunnel had been boarded across, floor to roof, with heavy planks nailed to a frame, and the planks were rotted soft and gray, but they were still standing, still nailed, sealing off a chamber behind them. Barnaby put his nose to the gap between 2 boards and began to whine, and then to dig, his front paws tearing at the salt floor. Gus came up behind, breathing hard, and when his lamp found the boarded wall he went absolutely still. "That's nothing," he said, but his voice had changed. "Empty room, been sealed since before I started, 40 years easy. Silas boarded it himself, told every crew that wall stays up. Nobody touches it, that was the rule." He wiped his mouth. "Mrs. Marsh, please." "Let's go up." But Barnaby had gotten a claw behind a board, and the old nail gave with a screech that ran up Delia's spine, and a plank swung loose and clattered down. Cold, stale air breathed out of the dark behind it. Barnaby went quiet. He looked back at Delia, and then he pushed his big head through the gap and disappeared into the black. She couldn't leave the dog. She pulled another board loose. The nails came out like teeth. Gus stood back and said nothing now, gripping his own lamp with both hands. She widened the gap until she could fit, and she climbed through with her lamp held out in front of her, and she stood up straight in the chamber Silas Marsh had sealed shut before her mother was even grown. It was a made room, not a mind face, not a storage cut. Somebody had lived here or worked here for a long time. Her lamp found a workbench along one wall, tools hung above it in neat rows, everything furred with 40 years of fine salt dust, a cot with a folded blanket, a lantern, shelves, and a dozen crates stacked along the back wall, and against the cold and the dry down here nothing had rotted. Salt keeps everything. Salt has kept meat and hides and secrets since the beginning of the world. Barnaby stood in the middle of the room, wagging his tail slowly, looking up at the shelf above the workbench. And on that shelf, in a careful row, were toys. Small wooden toys, a horse, a little wagon, a jointed doll with a painted face gone soft with age. A whole row of them, hand-carved, made with love by someone who knew what they were doing, set out and waiting, like a child had just stepped away and would be back any minute to play. Delia's throat closed. "Who lived down here?" she whispered. Gus had come through the gap behind her. He didn't answer. His lamp moved slowly over the toys and the cot and the crates, and his fist of a face had gone gray and old, and when he finally spoke his voice was barely there. "He never told me," Gus said. "In 41 years he never told me what was down here. He just said keep the wall up. And I did." He swallowed. "Lord above, I thought it was empty." Delia knelt by the nearest crate. The lid lifted with a soft crack. Inside, packed in straw, were letters. Bundles of them tied with string, hundreds of them, the ink still dark and clear. And on top, resting on the letters, was a leather ledger cracked at the spine. And when she opened it, the first page had a heading written in a strong, square hand. It said, "The Kowalski children. What is owed? What was done?" Delia didn't know that name. She'd never heard it. She sat back on her heels in the cold and the dust with the ledger open on her knees, and Barnaby lay down against her side with a sigh, like an animal that had finally finished a long job, and for a moment the room was still and calm and almost peaceful. The danger was gone. It was just an old man's hidden things, sad and strange, but over. Whatever this was, it had ended 40 years ago. She let out a breath she'd been holding since the cage dropped. It's over, she thought. It's just a story that ended a long time ago. She was wrong, because when she turned the page, the calm broke in one line. The line was written in Silas Marsh's square hand, and it read, "The fire that killed the Kowalski family did not kill all of them. I took the baby. I hid the baby. God forgive me for what I did to hide her, and God forgive them for why I had to." Delia's blood went cold, not sad cold, afraid cold, because in the same breath she understood two things at once. First, that this was not just an old man's secret. Somebody had done murder and covered it, and this room was the proof. And second, worse, a small, terrible thought she couldn't push away, that her mother Ruth had never once talked about her own childhood. Not one story, not one photograph. Ruth had told Delia only this flat when Delia was a girl and asked where she came from. "My whole family died in a fire when I was little. I was the only one who lived. Don't ask me about it. A fire, a baby, only one who lived." Delia's hand started to shake again, worse than in the cage. She turned the page. The letters told it in pieces, and she read them there on the floor while Gus held the lamp and stopped pretending he wanted to go up. She read for an hour. Here is what 40 years of a dead man's careful hand told her. The Kowalskis had been a mining family, immigrants, who came to work the salt in the 20s. There were the parents, 4 children, and a grandfather who held something no one else had: land. The Kowalski grandfather had bought a quarter section on the flat cheap when nobody wanted it, and it turned out that quarter section sat right over the richest salt in the whole district. The Prairie Rock Company wanted it. A man named Colonel Ashford, who owned the company then, offered to buy, and the old man wouldn't sell. It was going to be for his grandchildren. Salt is forever, he'd said. Let my grandchildren own something forever. He wouldn't sell. And in the spring of 1934, the Kowalski house burned to the ground in the night, and the newspaper said a lamp had tipped over and the whole family died. Parents, grandfather, 4 children. 8 coffins, 6 of them the size of a grown person and 2 of them small, and the town shook its head and said, "What a tragedy." And 3 weeks later, the widow, who inherited nothing, signed the land over to the Prairie Rock Company for pennies, because who wants to live on the ground where your whole line died? Except the fire wasn't an accident. Silas Marsh knew that because Silas Marsh was there. Now stop for a second. I know this is a lot. If you're the kind of person who feels a story in your chest, and you want to know how this widow and her dog cracked open a 40-year-old murder 900 feet underground, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now so you don't lose the thread. Because it gets bigger from here. A whole lot bigger. Silas Marsh had been a young man then, a mine hand, and more than that. He'd been sweet on the oldest Kowalski daughter, courting her the honest way, and on the night of the fire he'd walked out to the farm to see her. He got there in the dark and he saw 3 men from the company at the house. He saw them nail the doors. He saw them pour the kerosene. And Silas Marsh, 22 years old and unarmed and outnumbered 3-to-1, did the only thing a terrified boy could do. He ran to the back, to the low window of the children's room, and he broke it, and he pulled out the one child small enough to fit through his arms. A baby. A little girl not 2 years old. And then the roof went up and the heat drove him back and he could not reach the others, and he ran into the prairie with the baby screaming against his chest and the whole world on fire behind him. He couldn't go to the sheriff. The sheriff worked for the colonel. He couldn't go to the paper. The paper printed what the colonel said. 3 men had murdered a family for their land, and they would murder a witness and a surviving child without blinking, and Silas knew it. So he did the only thing a poor man with a mind to hide in could do. He hid her underground, right here, in this room. He carved out this chamber in the mine out west, where no one worked, and he brought the baby down and kept her in secret, feeding her, warming her, telling every soul above that the whole family had died. He told the crews the west workings were unsafe. He carved her toys on his own bench. He raised her in the dark for the first years, and then, when the colonel was old and the danger cooled, he brought her up quietly, moved away for a while, and passed her off in another county as an orphan niece. He gave her a new last name so that no Kowalski would ever be found alive to claim that land. He gave her the name Marsh. The baby's real name, the letters said, was Cora Kowalski. The name Silas gave her was Ruth Marsh. Delia stopped reading. The lamp was shaking in Gus's hand, and she realized it was because her own body was shaking against the crate. Ruth Marsh, her mother. Her closed, silent, hard-eyed mother who never told one story of her childhood, who flinched at the smell of smoke her whole life, who said only that a fire took her family. Her mother had not been a Marsh at all. Her mother had been the baby out the window, the last living Kowalski, which meant Delia was a Kowalski. June was a Kowalski. And the quarter section of land that the murdered grandfather swore would belong to his grandchildren forever, the richest salt in the district, the land the Prairie Rock Company had stolen with kerosene and 8 coffins, was, by every law of blood and inheritance, hers. That was why Silas sent her down, not to see the mine, to find the proof. He couldn't say it above the ground while the wrong people were alive. He couldn't trust it to a lawyer's envelope. He'd built the truth into stone 40 years deep and made her walk down into it herself so that no one could bury it again. "Colonel Ashford," Delia said. Her voice didn't sound like hers. Is that family still?" "Ashford still own Prairie Rock," Gus said quietly. "Grandson runs it now. Nolan Ashford. He's the buyer, Mrs. Marsh. He's the one wants to buy your mine off you. Been leaning on old Silas for years to sell, and Silas never would, and now Silas is gone and here you are." Something was breaking open in his old face. "I hauled salt for that company my whole life. I kept that wall up because he told me to. I never asked why." He looked at the little wooden horse on the shelf. "God help me. I helped them keep it quiet and I didn't even know." There it was. The nature of the whole thing had changed. An hour ago Delia had come down to sign a paper and sell a hole in the ground. Now she was sitting on the proof of a mass murder, with the blood of the victims in her own veins, and the family that did it was still up top, still rich, still powerful, and was, at that very moment, sitting in a lawyer's office with a contract, waiting for the tired little widow to sign away the one thing that could hang them. Because here's what Delia understood, cold and clear, kneeling in the dark. If she signed Nolan Ashford's paper and sold the mine, the deal would include the land. All of it. And the moment it was his, this room would be sealed again or flooded or collapsed, and the letters and the ledger and the little carved horse would be gone forever, and the Kowalski name would die the death the Ashfords had planned for it in 1934. She was the last door, and they were waiting for her to close it herself. She stood up. Her legs were steady now. Funny thing, fear. Sometimes it shakes you and sometimes it makes you still. "We're not leaving these down here," she said. "Not the ledger, not the letters, not one of these toys." She looked at Gus. "Will you help me carry them up?" The old foreman looked at the sealed room he'd guarded for 41 years without knowing what he guarded. He looked at the widow, and he set down his lamp and started stacking crates. They filled the cage twice. They rode up into the pale morning with the letters in their arms and Barnaby standing guard over the ledger like it was a living thing. And when Delia came out of that headframe into the wind, she did not go home. She drove straight to Wichita, to the office of Ferris the lawyer, with a crate on the seat and a 100-pound dog in the back and the shakes long gone, and she walked in without knocking. Nolan Ashford was already there. He was maybe 50, in a good gray suit, silver at the temples, the kind of man who smiles before he's finished sizing you up. He had the contract in front of him and a pen out, and he stood when she came in with that smile ready. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I hoped I'd catch you. I know this has all been overwhelming. Let me make it simple. I've upped the offer. It's a life-changing number, and honestly, for someone in your position, a single mother, a nurse, this is a gift." He slid the paper toward her. "Sign, and all of it is off your shoulders today." Delia set the crate down on the lawyer's desk. She lifted the lid, and she took out the ledger and laid it in front of Nolan Ashford, open to the page in Silas Marsh's square hand, and she watched the smile die on his face one muscle at a time. "The fire that killed the Kowalski family did not kill all of them," she read out loud, slow, so every word landed. "I took the baby. I hid the baby." She looked up. "The baby was my mother. Ruth Marsh was Cora Kowalski. Which makes that quarter section over your richest salt mine my land, Mr. Ashford. Stolen off my great-grandfather the night your grandfather's men nailed his doors shut and burned 8 people alive." She closed the ledger. "You didn't come here to buy a mine off a tired widow. You came to close the last mouth that could tell it, and you almost got me to do it for you." The room was dead quiet. Ferris the lawyer had gone white to his collar. Nolan Ashford stood very still. And then, because men like that never break clean, he tried the smile one more time. "That's a sad old story," he said softly. with no proof and no witnesses. Everyone in it is dead. You've got an old man's diary and a room full of junk. Sign the paper, take the money, and don't ruin your daughter's future chasing a ghost. Nobody's going to believe a nurse from Hutchinson over the Ashford name. Nobody ever has. And that was the moment it hung. That was the moment it could have gone either way, because he was right about one thing. He was rich, and she was tired, and the world does lean toward the Ashfords of it, and one word from her would end the fight, and one word would start a war she wasn't sure she could win. That's when Gus Halloran walked in. He'd followed her the whole way from the mine, 60-some years old, and 41 of them owed to Prairie Rock, and he came through the door with his hat in his hands and stood next to Delia. "There's a witness," Gus said. "There's me. I kept that wall up on Silas Marsh's orders for 41 years, and I'll swear in any court in this state what's behind it and why. And I'll tell them how you leaned on that old man to sell every single year till the day he died." He turned his fist of a face to Ashford. "You want to talk about who they'll believe? I'm the man who's dug your family's salt out of the ground since 1933. Let's find out." Nolan Ashford didn't smile again. He picked up his hat and his unused pen and he walked out, and the door swung shut behind him, and Delia Marsh stood in a lawyer's office holding a 40-year-old ledger with her whole life turned upside down inside it. It didn't end in that room, of course. Real things don't. It took 2 years. It took lawyers, better ones than Ferris, who came when they heard what was in the crates. It took the letters and Silas's testimony from beyond the grave in his own careful hand, and old Gus Halloran on a witness stand under oath, and a young reporter who wasn't afraid of the Ashford name and printed every word. It took Delia telling the story of her mother, the baby out the window, over and over until her voice went flat. The state opened the old case. They exhumed the Kowalski graves and found what everyone had looked away from in 1934, that some of those coffins had been weighted with sand, because there had never been that many bodies, and that made the murder impossible to call an accident anymore. The Prairie Rock Company did not survive it. The land, that quarter section the old grandfather swore would belong to his grandchildren forever, was returned by a court order to his heir, his great-granddaughter, a nurse from Hutchinson named Delia Marsh, who never had wanted salt and now owned the richest salt in Kansas. But that's not the part she'd tell you mattered. Here's the part that mattered. Somewhere in the deepest crate under the last bundle of letters, Silas had left one more thing: a photograph, cracked, brown with age but clear. It showed a young man, barely more than a boy, standing in front of a farmhouse in the sun, and beside him a girl in a plain dress laughing at something outside the frame, and in her arms a baby with a fat fist reaching up toward her face. On the back in the square hand it said, "Cora and her mother. The last day. I keep this so I never lie to myself about what I saved and what I couldn't." Delia had that photograph framed. She hung it in the front room of the small house that wasn't small anymore, next to the picture of Tom, and next to the one of her mother Ruth in her nurse's whites, hard-eyed and silent, and Delia understood now, carrying every single day the weight of being the only one who fit through the window. She understood the silence now. She understood the flinch at smoke. She forgave her mother everything, and she said so out loud to the photograph, which is a thing you can do when you finally know the truth. She kept the mine. She never sold it. She hired Gus Halloran to run it and paid the crews better than Prairie Rock ever had. And when Gus finally retired, she gave him the surface house to live out his days in. Because a man who keeps a wall up for 41 years and then tears it down for the truth deserves a warm place to sit. She took June down the cage once, when the girl was old enough, all the way to the 9th level to the room. She showed her daughter the workbench and the cot and the little carved horse, and she told her the whole thing, all of it, so that it would never again be a thing this family didn't talk about. And Barnaby, the old gray shepherd who'd pulled her into the dark and dug at a 40-year-old wall until it came down. He lived 3 more good years, and he slept every night at the foot of June's bed, and when he finally went quiet in his sleep, Delia buried him up on the flat on the quarter section, over the salt that is forever, where an old man's promise had finally come true. People asked her after how the dog knew, how he found a sealed room in 900 feet of dark that grown men had walked past for 40 years. She never had a good answer. Maybe he smelled the old wood. Maybe he smelled something we don't have a word for. All she knew was that a fist had once cracked against her whole family in the dark, and it took a boot slipping on a rusted cage, and a dog who wouldn't stop whining, and a tired widow who was finally too tired to do the safe thing, to drag the truth back up into the light. She'd gone down there to sell a hole in the ground and sign her family away for the last time. She came up owning her own name. And every time somebody tells her she got lucky, that a fortune fell out of the sky into a poor woman's lap, Delia Marsh just shakes her head, and she looks at the picture of the baby reaching up toward her laughing mother, and she says the truest thing she knows. "I didn't inherit money," she says. "I inherited my people. Everything else was just salt."